He bought her to save her family, but the transaction ended at the altar. "Never speak to me unless spoken to," the Duke of Somerset told his new bride, the carriage wheels grinding against the gravel of their departure. For 6 months, she obeyed. They lived as ghosts in a sprawling manor, bound by paper and silence. Until the night he stood in the shadows of a crowded ballroom and watched another man lift her bare hand, pressing a lingering kiss to her knuckles. Suddenly, the Duke's silence wasn't enough. The wedding lacked the scent of flowers. There was only the smell of cold stone, beeswax candles, and the faint, dusty odour of old hymnals. Beatrice stood beside Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Somerset, in a dress of pale ivory silk that felt more like a shroud than a celebration. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. They stared straight ahead at the vicar, two strangers participating in a business transaction drafted by lawyers and sealed with vows they neither meant nor understood. Her father's crushing debts were paid. Somerset's need for a respectable, quiet wife to manage his sprawling, neglected estates was met. "I do," Arthur said. His voice was gravelly, devoid of inflection. "I do," Beatrice echoed. Her voice did not shake. There was no celebratory breakfast. There were no weeping relatives waving them off. Within the hour, they were seated in a lacquered carriage bearing the Somerset crest, the heavy wheels tearing through the muddy roads leading out of London. The silence inside the carriage was absolute. It was a thick, physical thing, pressing against Beatrice's ribs. She sat rigidly upright, her gloved hands folded in her lap. The temperature was dropping as the afternoon wore on, a damp autumn chill seeping through the carriage doors, but she refused to shiver. Arthur sat opposite her. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and sharp-angled, with a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from the same unforgiving stone as his ancestral home. He stared out the window at the passing grey countryside. He had barely spoken 10 words to her since their introduction a month prior. Finally, as the carriage hit a deep rut, he turned his head. His eyes were a flat, unreadable grey. "Let us understand each other from the outset, madam," he said. The tone was conversational, which made the coldness of the words cut deeper. Beatrice met his gaze. "I am listening, Your Grace. I required a wife for the sake of the estate and the title. I did not require a companion." He leaned back against the leather squabs. "I have no interest in your thoughts, your domestic chatter, or your emotional needs. You will have a generous allowance. You will have free rein of the household staff, but you will not seek out my company." Beatrice felt a hard knot form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She was 24. She had spent the last 5 years watching her father drink away their inheritance, warding off creditors, and managing a household on pennies. She was not a romantic. She had not expected love. But the sheer brutality of his boundary struck a nerve. Arthur wasn't finished. "In fact," he added, looking back out the window, "never speak to me. Unless it is a matter of absolute necessity regarding the estate, or we are in the presence of others and must keep up appearances, keep your silence. I value my peace above all else." He waited. He expected tears. He expected a protest, a wounded gasp, perhaps even a lecture on Christian duty. Beatrice looked at the brass button on his heavy wool coat. She calculated the cost of her family's survival. It was exactly this: her voice, her presence, her humanity. "Understood," she said. It was a single word, crisp, unwavering. Arthur's eyes flicked back to her, a brief flash of surprise breaking his stoic mask. But he said nothing more. They arrived at Somerset House long after dark. The estate was a monolithic beast of limestone and dark windows, looming against a starless sky. The staff was lined up in the entrance hall. They looked exhausted. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and boiled cabbage. Arthur handed his wet coat to the butler. "Show the Duchess to her rooms in the east wing. I will be in my study." He didn't look back as he strode down the long, shadowed corridor. Beatrice followed the housekeeper up the grand, sweeping staircase. The carpet was threadbare in places. The portraits on the walls were covered in a thin layer of grime. She entered her bedchamber, a vast, draughty room with heavy velvet curtains and a fire that struggled to output any real heat. When the maid left, Beatrice stood alone in the center of the room. The silence of the carriage had followed her inside. It was going to be her permanent roommate. She walked over to the vanity, unpinned her heavy veil, and began to unbutton her own gown. Her fingers were stiff with cold. She did not cry. Crying was a useless expenditure of energy. Instead, she looked at her reflection in the spotted glass. "Never speak to me." "Fine," she whispered to the empty room. "Then I will not." The first week established the rhythm of their ghost marriage. They dined at opposite ends of a mahogany table that could seat 30. The only sounds were the clinking of silver against porcelain and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Arthur read his correspondence. Beatrice ate her soup. If she wanted the salt, she gestured to the footman. She did not ask Arthur to pass it. She did not ask him about his day. She did not bid him good morning or good night. Arthur found it deeply unsettling. He had expected her to break. Women, in his limited and largely transactional experience, used words as weapons or currency. They cajoled, they complained, they wept. He had built a fortress of silence to protect himself from the chaos he associated with human connection. But Beatrice did not batter at his gates. She simply turned her back and built a life outside them. Winter settled over Somerset House, freezing the ground and locking the inhabitants inside the sprawling estate. The silence between the Duke and Duchess did not thaw. It crystallized. Arthur was a man accustomed to being the center of his own isolated universe. He spent his days riding the property lines, managing tenant disputes, and poring over the estate finances in his study. He liked control. He liked predictability. But slowly, stealthily, the environment around him began to change. It started with the food. The boiled cabbage and tough meats vanished. In their place came roasted pheasant, rich root vegetable stews, and delicate pastries. The dining room, previously a cavern of draughts, was suddenly warm, the massive fireplaces roaring with properly seasoned wood. The silver was polished. The threadbare carpets were quietly replaced. He knew she was doing it. He just never caught her in the act. Beatrice treated Somerset House not as a prison, but as a project. If she was not allowed to speak, she would act. She spent hours in the dusty archives, locating the old household ledgers. She set up a small desk in the corner of the library, a room Arthur rarely used before noon, and went to work. She interviewed the staff. She fired the lazy cook and promoted the ambitious scullery maid. She reorganized the pantries, renegotiated with the local purveyors, and brought order to the chaos. And she did it all with a terrifying, efficient quiet. One rainy Tuesday in November, Arthur walked into the library to find a book on crop rotation. He stopped in the doorway. Beatrice was there. She was sitting at her small desk, entirely absorbed in a ledger. She wore a simple dress of dark blue wool, her hair pinned back practically. She held a pen in her right hand, tapping it lightly against her chin as she ran her finger down a column of numbers. She looked up at the sound of his boots. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the expanse of the room. The rain lashed against the tall windows. Arthur expected her to speak. It was the natural human impulse. A greeting, a comment on the weather, an explanation of what she was doing. Beatrice did none of those things. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, her face perfectly blank, then lowered her eyes back to the ledger and dipped her pen in the inkwell. The scratching of the nib against the parchment resumed. A strange, Hot irritation flared in Arthur's chest. It was entirely irrational. He had demanded this. He had explicitly ordered her not to speak. Yet her absolute compliance felt like a dismissal. She wasn't just obeying him. She was ignoring him. She had taken his punishment and turned it into her own armor. He turned on his heel and left the library, the book on crop rotation forgotten. As the months passed, the silence became a tangible third presence in the house. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers anymore. It was a heavy, loaded silence. A battle of wills. Arthur found himself watching her. He noticed the way she moved with purpose. He noticed that she had stopped wearing the restrictive, overly formal gowns of her London days, favoring practical, well-tailored dresses that allowed her to walk the muddy grounds. He noticed the respect she commanded from the servants, a respect he realized they gave to him out of fear, but gave to her out of genuine loyalty. They still dined together every evening. One night in late December, the footman dropped a crystal wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor with a deafening crash, breaking the heavy quiet of the room. The young servant froze, his face draining of color, terrified of the Duke's legendary temper. Arthur set his jaw, ready to snap at the boy's clumsiness. Before he could draw breath, Beatrice moved. She didn't speak. She didn't gasp. She calmly reached over, picked up her own linen napkin, and dropped it over the largest shards of glass near her chair. She looked at the footman, gave him a small, reassuring nod, and gestured gracefully toward the door, silently telling him to fetch a broom. The crisis was defused without a single syllable. The footman scurried away, looking at Beatrice as if she were a saint. Arthur stared at his wife from the opposite end of the table. The candlelight caught the sharp line of her cheekbone. She picked up a fork and resumed eating her fish, entirely unbothered. He realized, with a sudden, sinking feeling in his gut, that she was stronger than him. He needed silence to survive the world. She had conquered the silence and made it her own. He wanted to ask her about the ledgers. He wanted to ask her how she had fixed the draft in the east corridor. He wanted to know what she thought about when she sat by the fire, staring into the flames with that unreadable expression. But he couldn't. His pride was a physical barrier, thick and impenetrable. He had drawn the line in the sand on their wedding day. To cross it now would be to admit he was wrong. It would be to admit he was lonely, and Arthur Pendleton did not do lonely. So he swallowed his pride, finished his wine, and let the silence reign. But the ghost he had brought into his home was beginning to take on flesh and blood, and she was haunting him in ways he never anticipated. Spring brought the thaw, and with it, the unavoidable obligations of the London season. Arthur loathed the city. He loathed the noise, the smoke, and the endless, vapid social manoeuvring. But Parliament was in session, and the Duke of Somerset could not hide in the country forever. They travelled back to the capital in the same carriage they had taken 6 months prior. The dynamic, however, had shifted. The silence was no longer empty. It was taut, like a violin string pulled dangerously tight. Their London townhouse had been prepared by an advanced team of staff. Beatrice stepped into the foyer, peeling off her travelling gloves, her eyes immediately scanning the cornices for dust, assessing the lighting, falling instantly into her role as manager. "We are expected at the Earl of Harrington's ball on Thursday," Arthur said. It was the first time he had spoken to her in 3 weeks. Beatrice paused on the stairs. She didn't turn around. She merely offered a single nod of acknowledgement and continued her ascent. Arthur watched her go, a muscle ticking in his jaw. Thursday arrived with a torrential downpour, but the Harrington ballroom was a blazing inferno of chandeliers, silk, and suffocating perfume. When they were announced, Arthur offered Beatrice his arm. It was a requirement of polite society. She placed her hand on his sleeve. Even through the heavy wool of his evening coat, He could feel the coldness of her touch. She didn't lean into him. She maintained a fraction of an inch of space between their bodies, close enough to satisfy the gossips, far enough to remind him of his own rules. They descended the grand staircase. Beatrice was a revelation. Arthur had grown accustomed to the practical woman in dark wool reading ledgers in the country. Tonight, she wore a gown of deep emerald green velvet that hugged the swell of her hips and dipped modestly but dangerously at the collarbone. Her hair was swept up in a complex arrangement of braids threaded with seed pearls. She looked regal. She looked untouchable. And immediately, she was swept away from him. Somerset. Good God, man, we haven't seen you since the wedding. Arthur was cornered by two elderly lords discussing the corn laws. He gave them half his attention. The other half was tracking the emerald green dress through the crowd. He watched Beatrice navigate the room. She was masterful. She smiled politely, nodded at the right intervals, and offered brief, socially acceptable responses. She fulfilled the letter of his law, keeping up appearances, while maintaining the spirit of her own silence. She never lingered. She never gossiped. Arthur stood by a marble pillar, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand, feeling an unfamiliar sensation twisting in his chest. It was a tight, possessive ache. He told himself it was just the irritation of the crowd. Then the crowd parted, and the emerald dress stopped moving. Beatrice was standing near the entrance to the conservatory. She was looking at a man. The man was tall, with a head of thick, sandy blonde hair and a disarming, easy smile. He wore a coat of midnight blue that fit a little too perfectly. Arthur didn't know him, but he knew the way the man was looking at his wife. It wasn't the polite, distant gaze of an acquaintance. It was warm. It was familiar. Arthur shifted his weight, his grip tightening on his glass. He watched the blonde man step into Beatrice's personal space. He watched him say something. And then Arthur saw something that made the blood roar in his ears. Beatrice smiled. It wasn't the tight, polite smile she gave the lords and ladies of the Tun. It was a genuine, soft smile that reached her eyes. The mask of the stoic, silent duchess cracked, revealing the living, breathing woman beneath. Arthur felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He had lived with her for 6 months. He had eaten hundreds of meals with her. He had never seen her smile like that. He put his glass down on a passing tray with too much force and began to move through the crowd. By the time he reached the edge of the dance floor, they were gone. Panic, swift and irrational, seized him. He pushed past a cluster of dowagers, his eyes scanning the room. The conservatory doors were slightly ajar. Arthur stepped into the humid, floral-scented air of the glass room. It was dimly lit, shadows playing across the broad leaves of exotic ferns. He heard her voice before he saw her. "You shouldn't have come, Thomas." Her voice. He hadn't heard her speak a full sentence since the carriage ride. It was softer than he remembered. Warmer. "I had to see you, Bee," a male voice replied. "There!" Arthur moved silently down the gravel path, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stopped behind a massive potted palm, looking through the fronds. They were standing near a stone fountain. The man, Thomas, was standing very close to her. Too close. "You are a married woman now," Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave. "To a monster, if the rumors are true. They say he locks you away in the country. They say he doesn't even speak to you." Arthur stopped breathing. Beatrice looked down at the water in the fountain. "Rumors are often exaggerated." "Are they?" Thomas stepped closer. He reached out and took her hand. Arthur's hand drifted to his side, his fingers curling into a fist. He wanted to step out. He wanted to demand the man unhand his wife. But he was paralyzed by the very trap he had set. He had told her he didn't care. He had told her they were strangers. What right did he have to intervene? "Bee," Thomas murmured. "Look at me." Beatrice didn't pull her hand away. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Slowly, deliberately, Thomas lifted her hand. He didn't kiss the air above her glove, as was proper. He turned her hand over, his thumb brushing against her bare wrist where her glove ended, and pressed a long, lingering kiss to her skin. Arthur felt something inside him snap. It was a loud, violent break. The fortress of ice and silence he had built around himself shattered into a million jagged pieces. He didn't think, he simply moved. He stepped out from behind the palm tree, the gravel crunching loudly under his boots. Thomas jumped back, dropping Beatrice's hand as if he had been burned. Beatrice turned, her eyes widening slightly as she saw her husband emerging from the shadows. Arthur didn't look at Thomas. He locked eyes with Beatrice. His chest was heaving, his jaw clamped so tight his teeth ached. He looked at her wrist, still flushed from the other man's touch. The silence between them had never felt so dangerous. It was no longer a void. It was a loaded weapon, aimed squarely at both their hearts. "We are leaving," Arthur said. His voice was dangerously low, vibrating with a rage he couldn't contain. He didn't wait for her to agree. He didn't offer his arm. He turned and stalked back toward the ballroom, leaving her no choice but to follow. The game of ghosts was over. The haunting had finally begun. The carriage door slammed shut with the force of a gunshot. The sound echoed off the wet cobblestones of Mayfair, scattering a nearby cluster of pigeons into the damp night air. Inside the velvet-lined cab, the air was entirely removed. Arthur sat opposite Beatrice, his large frame rigid, his breathing audible over the grinding of the wooden wheels. The street lamps flickered through the rain-streaked glass, casting harsh, moving shadows across his face. He looked dangerous. The stoic, unbothered Duke was gone, replaced by a man gripping his walking stick so tightly the knuckles of his thick gloves strained against the leather. Beatrice stared straight ahead. She did not shrink back against the cushions. Her pulse was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, right where Thomas had kissed her wrist just minutes before. But she kept her chin leveled. 2 streets passed in agonizing silence. The tension was a physical pressure in the confined space, swelling until it threatened to crack the windows. Arthur broke first. He broke his own ironclad rule. "Who is he?" His voice wasn't a yell. It was a low, ragged scrape, dragging against the floorboards of the carriage. Beatrice shifted her gaze from the window to her husband. She noted the rigid set of his jaw, the hard, flat anger in his eyes. She felt a sudden, dangerous spike of adrenaline. For 6 months, she had been a ghost in his house, managing his ledgers, eating his food, breathing his air while he looked right through her. Now, finally, he saw her. And it was only because another man had looked first. She considered not answering. She considered citing his mandate. "Never speak to me." But the bitter satisfaction of that revenge felt hollow compared to the anger now rising in her own chest. "His name is Thomas Linfield," Beatrice said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "Linfield," Arthur repeated, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "And what exactly is your relationship with Mr. Linfield that he feels entitled to corner you in dark rooms and maul you like a tavern maid?" Beatrice's eyes flashed. "He did not maul me. We were conversing. He was kissing your bare skin. He is an old friend. Friends do not hide in conservatories." Arthur leaned forward, his massive shoulders crowding the small space between them. The scent of rain, starch, and brandy came with him. "Let us not play games, Beatrice. You are my wife. You bear my name. I will not be made a fool of before the entire ton, because you harbor a sentimental attachment to a childhood playmate." "You are not being made a fool of," she snapped, her composure finally fracturing. "He merely offered his sympathies." "Sympathies?" Arthur barked a harsh, humorless laugh. "For what? The tragedy of having your father's debts erased? The horror of living in the largest estate in Somerset? For the reality of my marriage, your grace, she fired back, the honorific dripping with acid. The carriage hit a pothole, jostling them, but neither broke eye contact. You agreed to the terms, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You agreed to a transaction. I bought your father's ruined estate. I paid his gambling debts. I saved your family from the debtor's prison. In exchange, I required fidelity and respectability. I have given you both, Beatrice said, her hands curling into tight fists in her lap. I have managed your home. I have fixed the rot in your ledgers. I have sat across from you for 184 dinners in absolute, suffocating silence because you commanded it. I have been precisely what you paid for. Then why was he holding your hand? The question hung in the air, stripped of its aristocratic veneer. It sounded raw. It sounded almost human. Beatrice looked at the man who owned her. She saw the wealth in the cut of his coat, the power in the broad set of his shoulders, and the utter, hollow isolation in his eyes. Thomas was a neighbor, she said quietly, the anger draining away, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. Before my father lost everything, there was an understanding between our families. When the debts became insurmountable, Thomas's father forbade the match. They did not have the capital to save us. You did. Arthur stared at her. The narrative clicked into place with sickening clarity. Linfield wasn't just a flirt. He was the ghost of a life she was supposed to have. He was the man she would have married if money had not dictated her fate. A dark, possessive fury wrapped around Arthur's lungs, tightening until he could barely draw breath. He had thought he was shielding himself from the messiness of emotion by demanding her silence. Instead, he had left her alone with her memories of another man. He is not to approach you again, Arthur said. The command was absolute. Beatrice looked away, staring back out the rain-slicked window. I do not control the guest lists of London, Arthur. It was the first time she had ever used his given name. The syllables hung between them, jarring and intimate. Then I will control who you speak to, he replied. The carriage rolled to a halt in front of their townhouse. The footman opened the door, letting in the noise of the street and the cold rain. Arthur stepped out first. He did not offer his hand to help her down. He couldn't. His hands were shaking. He walked into the house, leaving his wife to follow in his shadow. The fracture in their silent world, now a gaping chasm neither knew how to cross. The next morning, the townhouse on Grosvenor Square felt different. The air was heavier, charged with the static residue of the night before. Normally, when they were in London, Arthur took his breakfast early and left for his club or the House of Lords before Beatrice even descended the stairs. They maintained separate orbits, relying on the vastness of the city to keep them apart. Today, when Beatrice entered the morning room at 9 o'clock, Arthur was sitting at the head of the table. She paused in the doorway. She wore a simple day dress of dove grey, her hair tied back in a practical knot. She looked at him, waiting for him to rise, to leave, to do whatever it was he did to avoid her. He didn't move. He lowered the morning paper and looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "Good morning," he said. Beatrice felt a jolt of shock, quickly masked by years of practiced restraint. She walked to her chair at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. The footman pulled it out for her. She sat down. "Good morning," she replied cautiously. The footman poured her tea and retreated to the edges of the room, blending into the patterned wallpaper. Arthur did not return to his paper. He folded it and laid it flat on the table. He watched her. Beatrice reached for the toast rack. She felt his eyes on her hands. She felt his eyes on the line of her throat as she swallowed her tea. It was unnerving. For half a year, she had been a piece of furniture in his life. Now, she felt like prey under the gaze of a hawk. She buttered her toast with precise, deliberate movements. She refused to squirm. Your work on the Somerset ledgers, Arthur said suddenly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. I reviewed the quarterly reports before we left the country. You found a discrepancy in the grain sales. Beatrice stopped chewing. She dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin. I did. The estate manager was underreporting the yield and selling the surplus privately. I dismissed him and hired his assistant in his place. The assistant is honest, if unimaginative. Arthur nodded slowly. You did not inform me. You requested I only speak to you on matters of absolute necessity. I deemed the matter handled, and therefore not a necessity. He absorbed the hit. It was a flawless deployment of his own rules against him. I see, he murmured. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. And what else have you handled in my absence, Beatrice? What other fires have you put out while I was enjoying my peace? She met his gaze. The flat grey emptiness she was used to seeing in his eyes was gone. In its place was a sharp, focused intensity that made her skin prickle. Many things, Your Grace, she said. The roof in the west wing was leaking. The tenant farmers in the lower valley needed their leases renegotiated. The butcher was overcharging us by 20%. It is all in the ledgers. I don't want to read it in the ledgers, he said. The words came out harsher than he intended. Beatrice frowned, a delicate furrow appearing between her brows. I do not understand what you want from me. I want... Arthur stopped. What did he want? He wanted to go back in time and punch Thomas Linfield in his perfectly symmetrical jaw. He wanted to erase the look of soft familiarity she had given the other man. He wanted to know what she was thinking when she stared into the fire at night. He realized with a deep, unsettling dread that he wanted her. Not as a manager, not as a prop, as a wife. I want you to accompany me to Hyde Park this afternoon, he said. Beatrice's eyes widened slightly. Hyde Park? For the promenade? Yes, we have never ridden in the park together. It was the most public, visible stage in London society. It was where couples went to be seen, to display their status, and to perform their marriages for the ton. Then it is time we started, Arthur said. He stood up, throwing his napkin onto the table. He was a large man, and his sudden movement seemed to swallow all the oxygen in the room. Have the carriage brought round at 3. Wear something warm. The wind is sharp today. He strode out of the room before she could object. At exactly 3 o'clock, Beatrice stood in the foyer. She wore a tailored pelisse of dark plum wool, a matching bonnet framing her face. She felt ridiculous. She felt as though she were marching to the gallows. Arthur descended the stairs. He was impeccably dressed in a dark blue coat, a crisp white cravat, and tall riding boots. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her. He didn't speak. He simply offered his arm. Beatrice hesitated for a fraction of a second, then placed her gloved hand on his sleeve. The muscle beneath the wool was rock hard. The open carriage ride through Hyde Park was an exercise in endurance. The pathways were choked with phaetons, barouches, and gentlemen on horseback. Every time they passed an acquaintance, Arthur tipped his hat. Beatrice offered a measured smile. The whispers trailed them like a wake behind a ship. The Duke and Duchess of Somerset, the most notoriously cold couple in England, parading together in the afternoon sun. Arthur did not speak to her, but his presence was a heavy, inescapable gravity. He sat closer to her than he ever had in a carriage. When the vehicle hit a bump, his thigh brushed against hers, a solid, grounding heat that sent a jolt up her spine. They circled the Serpentine. Beatrice kept her eyes on the water, trying to ignore the hyper-awareness humming in her veins. There, Arthur said suddenly, his voice low, pitched only for her ears. Beatrice followed his gaze. Riding toward them on a sleek grey gelding was Thomas Linfield. Beatrice felt her stomach drop. Thomas looked up, catching sight of the Somerset carriage. A smile broke across his face, and he spurred his horse forward, weaving through the slower traffic to approach them. Arthur's arm, which had been resting casually on the side of the carriage, went rigid. "Do not speak to him," Arthur commanded softly, his eyes fixed on the approaching rider. "Arthur, he is coming directly toward us. It would be entirely improper." "I do not care about propriety. I am your husband. Look at me." Beatrice snapped her head toward him, startled by the raw command in his tone. Arthur was not looking at Thomas anymore. He was looking at her. His eyes were dark, burning with a fierce, territorial intensity that took her breath away. Thomas pulled his horse alongside the carriage, tipping his hat. "Your Grace, Duchess, a fine afternoon for a drive." Arthur turned his head slowly. He looked at Thomas the way a man might look at a smear of mud on his boot. He did not smile. He did not return the greeting. He simply stared, his silence a weapon honed by 6 months of practice, now deployed against an enemy. Thomas's smile faltered. He looked at Beatrice, expecting her to fill the void, to smooth over the social awkwardness. Beatrice looked at Thomas. She saw the easy charm, the golden hair, the familiar face of her youth. And then she felt the heavy, vibrating tension of the man sitting beside her. She felt Arthur's heat, his anger, his overwhelming, undeniable presence. She turned away from Thomas. She looked straight ahead at the carriage driver's back. She kept her silence. The carriage rolled on, leaving Thomas Linfield behind in the dust. Arthur let out a long, slow breath. He didn't say a word for the rest of the drive, but as they rounded the corner toward the park gates, he reached across the space between them. He didn't take her hand. He simply rested his large, gloved palm over hers, pressing her fingers against her lap. He kept it there all the way home. 2 nights later, the damp chill of London gave way to a clear, crisp evening. Society descended upon the King's Theatre for the opera. It was the premiere of a new Italian tragedy, though the true spectacle was, as always, the audience itself. Beatrice sat in the Somerset box, flanked by crimson velvet curtains and gilded plasterwork. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that left her shoulders bare, a heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. A family heirloom Arthur had instructed his valet to deliver to her room that afternoon without a note. The weight of the stones felt like a collar. Arthur sat to her right. He was dressed in stark black and white evening wear, his presence commanding the small enclosed space. Since the carriage ride in Hyde Park, a bizarre truce had settled over them. It wasn't peace, it was a heavily armed ceasefire. He was constantly near her, a looming, watchful guardian. Yet they rarely exchanged more than 10 words. The overture began, the music sweeping up from the orchestra pit and filling the cavernous theatre. Beatrice kept her opera glasses trained on the stage, trying to lose herself in the swelling violins. But she could feel him. Arthur wasn't looking at the stage. He was looking out over the stalls, his eyes tracking the crowd. "He is in the pit," Arthur said quietly, his voice cutting under the music. Beatrice didn't have to ask who he meant. Her grip on the mother-of-pearl opera glasses tightened. She didn't look down. "You are becoming obsessed, Arthur." "I am becoming observant," he corrected, shifting his weight. He leaned forward, placing his arm along the padded velvet ledge of the box, leaning into her space. He was so close she could smell the clean, sharp scent of his shaving soap and the faint spice of his cologne. "He is looking up here," Arthur murmured, his breath brushing against her bare shoulder. Beatrice shivered. The theatre was warm, but the sudden proximity of her husband sent a cold shock over her skin. "Let him look. It changes nothing, doesn't it?" Arthur slowly reached out. He didn't touch her face or her hand. He let his fingertips brush the clasp of the diamond necklace at the nape of her neck. The touch was agonizingly light, a stark contrast to the heavy, calloused strength of his hands. Beatrice sucked in a breath, her spine snapping straight. Down in the pit, Thomas Linfield stood near the centre aisle. He held his own opera glasses, and they were pointed squarely at the Somerset box. Arthur knew exactly what the other man saw. He saw the Duke leaning intimately close to his Duchess. He saw the proprietary hand resting near her bare neck. He saw a man claiming what belonged to him. But this wasn't just for Linfield's benefit anymore. Arthur let his hand trail down, his thumb dragging lightly across the skin of her upper back, just above the silk of her dress. Beatrice closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She should pull away. She should remind him of the bitter terms he had set on their wedding day. She should tell him that a few days of territorial jealousy did not erase half a year of treating her like a phantom, but the touch was intoxicating. It was the first time in 6 months another human being had touched her with intent, with something resembling warmth. She turned her head slightly, looking at him over her shoulder. Her dark eyes met his grey ones. The noise of the opera, the crowded theatre, the watching eyes of Thomas Linfield, it all faded into background static. "What are you doing?" she whispered. The question meant only for him. "What I should have done months ago," Arthur replied, his voice a low rumble. He moved his hand, dropping it to the back of her chair. But he didn't pull away. He stayed close, his shoulder brushing against hers. "You told me never to speak to you," Beatrice reminded him, the hurt of those first days bleeding through her stoic armor. "You told me you didn't want a companion. You wanted a ghost." Arthur's jaw tightened. He looked at the stage, watching the soprano throw herself dramatically across a prop bed. But he didn't see the performance. He saw his own arrogance. He saw the fortress he had built to keep out the pain of his chaotic childhood, a fortress that had ended up trapping him in isolation. "I was a coward," Arthur said softly. It was a confession, dragged out of him against his will. Beatrice blinked, stunned by the admission. The Duke of Somerset did not admit fault. He did not show weakness. "I thought," Arthur continued, his voice barely audible over the swelling aria, "that if I expected nothing from you, I could not be disappointed. I thought silence was safety." He turned his head, locking his gaze with hers again. "I was wrong. The silence is maddening, and watching that boy put his mouth on your skin made me realize that I do not want to be safe anymore." Beatrice stared at him, her heart thumping heavily in her chest. She searched his face for a lie, for a trick of the dim theatre lighting. But his expression was raw. The cynical, hardened armor was cracking, piece by piece. "You are a difficult man to believe, Arthur," she said softly. "Then I will have to prove it." He didn't wait for her permission. He reached down and took her hand, the same hand Thomas had kissed. He didn't pull it to his lips. He simply laced his fingers through hers, his large, warm grip enveloping her cold one. He rested their joined hands on the velvet ledge, in full view of the theatre below. It was a declaration. It was a wager of pride, laid out on the table for everyone to see. Down in the pit, Thomas lowered his glasses, his face tight, before turning and pushing his way through the crowd towards the exit. Arthur didn't watch him go. He kept his eyes on the stage, his thumb slowly stroking the back of Beatrice's hand. Beatrice looked down at their intertwined fingers. The diamonds heavy on her chest, the music swelling in the air, the heat of the man beside her. It was overwhelming. The ghost marriage was dead. Whatever was taking its place was breathing, fragile, and utterly terrifying. She did not pull her hand away. For the rest of the night, she held on, stepping out of the silence and into the fire. The carriage ride back to Grosvenor Square was stripped of the frantic, suffocating tension of the previous days. In its place was a heavy, exhausted quiet. It was the silence of a battlefield after the cannons have stopped firing. Arthur did not let go of her hand. He kept his fingers laced with hers, his thumb resting against her pulse point, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of her blood. It grounded him. For the first time in his adult life, he was tethered to another human being by choice. They arrived at the townhouse. The footmen were waiting, their faces professionally blank as they took Arthur's hat and Beatrice's velvet cloak. The house was dark, save for the candelabras burning in the entrance hall. Beatrice moved toward the stairs. She was tired, the adrenaline of the opera, the weight of the diamonds, the overwhelming heat of Arthur's sudden, territorial claim. It all settled into her bones like lead. She heard his heavy boots on the stairs behind her. He was following. Usually they parted at the landing. He went right toward the master suite. She went left. Tonight, when she turned left, he turned with her. She stopped in front of her bedroom door. The polished mahogany stood between them and the private domain she had built for herself. She put her hand on the brass knob, but did not turn it. She looked up at him. He was standing too close. He always seemed to be standing too close now, his sheer physical size blocking out the rest of the corridor. The candlelight cast deep shadows in the hollows of his cheeks. He looked dangerous, yes, but he also looked desperately uncertain. "You claimed me tonight?" Beatrice said. Her voice was low, careful not to wake the sleeping house. "I did," Arthur replied. He didn't look away. "You made a spectacle. You proved to Thomas Linfield, and to anyone else looking, that I am your property." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "You are my wife. An estate is property. A ledger is property. A wife is a person." She let go of the doorknob and turned to face him fully. "For 6 months, I was the ghost you requested. I kept your house. I saved your money. I swallowed my pride and my voice because you bought the right to demand my silence. Now, another man looks at me, and suddenly you decide I am worth your attention." Arthur's eyes darkened. He stepped forward, crowding her against the heavy wooden door. "Do not reduce this to jealousy, Beatrice." "Then what is it, Arthur?" she challenged, her chin lifting. "What exactly changed? Because if this is merely a matter of your pride being pricked, you can go back to your own room. I will not be a pawn in a pissing contest between you and a man I haven't spoken to in 3 years." He stared down at her. The air in the narrow hallway felt suddenly thick. He wanted to reach out and pull her against him. He wanted to silence her arguments with his mouth, to drag her into the dark bedroom and prove with his hands what he could not articulate with his tongue. But he looked into her dark, unyielding eyes, and he knew it would be a mistake. She wasn't a conquered territory. She was a fortress. If he forced the gates now, he would lose her forever. "My father," Arthur said. The words tasted like rust. He hadn't spoken of the previous duke in a decade. "My father was a man ruled entirely by his passions. He loved loudly. He wept in public. He threw away the family fortune on mistresses, bad investments, and emotional whims. He died leaving this family in absolute ruin." Beatrice stopped breathing. She didn't interrupt. "I spent my entire life cleaning up the wreckage of his feelings," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. "I swore I would never let sentiment dictate my life. I built order. I demanded control. When I married you, I thought I was protecting myself. I thought if I kept you at a distance, if I demanded silence, I could keep the chaos out." He raised his hand. His knuckles brushed against her cheekbone. The touch was agonizingly gentle. "But you aren't chaos, Beatrice," he said. "You took the broken, freezing house I gave you, and you made it warm. You took my silence, and you turned it into peace. You didn't break my rules, you survived them. And watching that boy touch you, it didn't just hurt my pride, it terrified me. Because I realized I have spent 6 months pushing away the only good thing that has ever happened to me." Beatrice stared at him. The cynical armored duke was gone. In his place was a man stripped down to his marrow, offering her the one thing he had sworn never to give anyone: the truth. Tears, hot and sudden, pricked the back of her eyes. She refused to let them fall. "You told me never to speak to you," she whispered. Arthur rested his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes. "I was a fool. Speak to me, Beatrice. Yell at me. Demand things of me. Tear the house down. Just don't shut me out." She let out a shaky breath. She reached up, her gloved hands gripping the lapels of his black evening coat. She felt the heavy, thundering beat of his heart beneath the wool. "Go to bed, Arthur," she said softly. He stiffened. He opened his eyes, the rejection hitting him like a physical blow. "Go to bed," she repeated, her grip on his coat tightening for a fraction of a second before she let go. "I have heard your words. I believe them. But 6 months of ice does not thaw in a single night. You broke this marriage on the day it began. You are going to have to do more than apologize to fix it." She turned the knob and pushed the door open. She stepped inside, the warmth of the fire spilling out into the cold hallway. Arthur stood rooted to the floorboards. He watched her cross the threshold. "How?" he asked. Beatrice looked back over her shoulder. The firelight caught the diamonds at her throat. "Figure it out. You're the Duke." She closed the door. The click of the latch echoed loudly in the empty corridor. Arthur stood in the dark for a long time, staring at the wood, before he finally turned and walked away. For 3 days, it rained. It was a relentless, punishing London downpour that turned the streets to mud and trapped society indoors. Inside the townhouse, the silence returned. But it was fundamentally altered. It was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of anticipation. Arthur did not crowd her. He did not issue commands. Instead, he began to dismantle the walls he had built, brick by brick. It started the next morning. Beatrice came down to the breakfast room to find the morning paper folded neatly beside her plate. Arthur was already gone to his study, but on top of the paper sat a heavy iron key. Beside it was a note, written in his sharp, slanted hand. "The West Wing Archives at Somerset House. The ledgers from my grandfather's time. They are a mess. I would value your mind on them." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was better. It was an invitation into the very heart of his world. It was respect. That afternoon, he had his solicitor deliver the revised household budgets to her sitting room. He hadn't just approved her changes. He had doubled the discretionary funds she was allowed to manage without his oversight. He was handing her power. On the 3rd day, the rain finally broke. Beatrice ordered the carriage to visit her dressmaker on Bond Street. She needed a new riding habit, and she needed an hour out of the house to clear her head. The constant, quiet siege Arthur was laying to her defenses was wearing her down. She stepped out of the modiste's shop, buttoning her gloves, when a figure stepped out from the awning next door. "B," she stopped. Thomas Linfield stood on the wet pavement. He looked tired. The easy, golden charm he usually wore was entirely absent, replaced by a sullen, bitter edge. "Thomas," she said. Her voice was flat. She didn't feel the nostalgic pull she had felt in the conservatory. She just felt tired. "He's playing a game with you," Thomas said, stepping closer. He glanced nervously at her carriage, where the footman was watching them with hawkish attention. "I saw him at the opera. He was marking his territory. He doesn't care for you, B. He's a cold, miserable bastard who only wants what he owns to stay exactly where he puts it." Beatrice looked at the man she had once thought she might marry. She looked at his perfectly tailored coat and his desperate, angry eyes. He wasn't trying to save her. He was trying to soothe his own wounded ego. "He is a difficult man, yes," Beatrice said evenly. "He's a monster. Leave him." My father's investments have turned. I have capital now. I can take you away to the continent. We can petition for an annulment based on cruelty. You don't have to live in that freezing tomb with a man who doesn't even speak to you." He reached for her hand. Beatrice stepped back. The movement was sharp, definitive. Thomas's hand fell to his side. "You do not understand him," Beatrice said, "and you do not understand me. I have known you since we were children. You knew a girl who had no choices," she corrected, her voice hardening. "You knew a girl whose father drank away her dowry, while your family quietly shut their doors to us. Arthur Pendleton did not shut his door. He paid the debts. He saved my family from the street. Yes, he demanded a terrible price for it. But he never lied to me. He never made promises he didn't keep. He is honest in his cruelty, Thomas. You are only honest when it is convenient." Thomas stared at her, his face flushing a dull red. "You're defending him, after what he's done to you." "I am not defending him," she said, pulling her cloak tighter against the damp air. "I am stating the facts. He gave me a ruined estate, and I rebuilt it. He gave me silence, and I found my own voice in it. And now he is giving me his respect. You only ever wanted my adoration." She turned toward her carriage. The footman immediately opened the door. "He will freeze you to death, Bee." Thomas spat at her back. Beatrice paused with one foot on the carriage step. She looked back at him, her expression perfectly serene. "He is already thawing," she said. "Good day, Mr. Linfield." She climbed into the carriage, the door snapping shut behind her. As the vehicle rolled down Bond Street, she didn't look out the window. She realized, with a sudden, overwhelming clarity, that she didn't want the easy, uncomplicated romance of a boy. She wanted the difficult, hard-won devotion of a man. When she returned to Grosvenor Square, the butler met her in the hall. "His Grace is in his study, madam. He asked that you join him when you returned." Beatrice handed her cloak to a maid. Her heart kicked into a steady, heavy rhythm. She walked down the long corridor, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She didn't knock. She turned the brass handle and walked in. The study was dark, smelling of leather, ink, and wood smoke. Arthur stood by the window, his back to the door, staring out at the small walled garden at the rear of the townhouse. He had shed his formal coat and cravat. He wore only a white linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing the thick cords of muscle in his forearms. He turned when he heard the door close. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her. The vulnerability she had seen in the hallway 3 nights ago was still there, but it was no longer frantic. It was settled. It was a man who had made his choice and was waiting for the axe to fall. Beatrice walked toward the massive oak desk in the center of the room. She looked down. Spread across the polished wood were papers, not ledgers, not budgets. They were letters, dozens of them, written in Arthur's sharp, aggressive hand. Most of them were crumpled, half-finished, crossed out. She looked at the top sheet. "Dear Beatrice, I do not have the vocabulary for this." She looked at another. "To my wife. I spent today walking the estate. I saw the roof you fixed. I saw the tenants you fed. I am a blind man." She looked up at him. "What is this, Arthur?" "I am not a man of words," he said quietly. He walked away from the window, stopping on the opposite side of the desk. "You asked me to fix it. I do not know how to court a woman. I do not know how to write poetry. I only know how to manage estates and draft contracts. So I sat here for 3 days trying to draft a contract that would make you stay." He reached across the desk and picked up a single, clean sheet of parchment. He slid it toward her. Beatrice looked down. It wasn't a letter. It was a deed. It was the deed to her father's former estate in Kent, the property her family had lost to creditors, the property Arthur had purchased to clear the debts. I transferred the title this morning, Arthur said, his voice completely flat, betraying none of the absolute terror churning in his gut. It is in your name, yours exclusively. You have an independent income tied to it. If you want to leave me, if you want to take your revenge for the last 6 months and walk out that door, you will do so as a wealthy, independent woman. You will never have to answer to me or any other man ever again. Beatrice stared at the heavy parchment. The wax seal of the crown was stamped at the bottom. It was freedom. Absolute, unequivocal freedom. It was the undoing of the transaction that had bound them. She looked up at him. His jaw was clenched so tight the bone looked ready to snap. His eyes were fixed on her face, waiting for her to pick up the paper and walk away. He was giving her the weapon to destroy him, because he loved her enough to let her use it. "You are a fool," she whispered. Arthur flinched. He looked down at the desk. "I know." "No," Beatrice said, her voice rising, shaking with a sudden, fierce emotion. "You are a fool if you think I want this." She grabbed the heavy parchment. She didn't fold it. She didn't tuck it away. She tore it in half. The sound of the tearing paper ripped through the quiet study like a gunshot. Arthur's head snapped up, his eyes widening in shock. She put the two halves together and tore them again. She threw the pieces onto the desk. "I don't want an escape clause, Arthur," she said, her chest heaving. "I don't want a separate life in Kent. I want the life I built at Somerset House. I want the ledgers. I want the drafty halls. And I want the stubborn, arrogant, terrified man who owns them." Arthur stared at the shredded deed, then at his wife. The iron control he had maintained for 30 years finally, utterly broke. He moved around the desk. It wasn't a hesitant approach. It was a collision. He grabbed her waist, his large hands pulling her hard against his chest. Beatrice gasped as the air was knocked out of her. She tilted her head back, and his mouth came down on hers. There was nothing polite about it. It was a desperate, messy crash of teeth and breath. It tasted of the brandy he had been drinking, and the sheer, starving relief of a man who had been drowning for 6 months and finally found air. Beatrice threw her arms around his neck, her fingers tangling in the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck. She kissed him back with the exact same ferocity, pouring every ounce of frustration, anger, and suppressed longing from the last half-year into the connection. He backed her up, pushing her against the heavy oak edge of the desk. The scattered, crumpled letters went flying, fluttering to the floor like snow. Arthur tore his mouth away, his breathing ragged. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his lips pressing against the rapid pulse beating there. "Beatrice," he groaned. It was a surrender. It was a prayer. "You told me never to speak to you," she breathed, her hands clutching his shoulders. Arthur dragged his lips up her jawline, his hand sliding up to cup her face. His thumb stroked her cheekbones, his eyes burning into hers with an intensity that stripped her bare. "Never stop," he ordered, his voice raw. "Talk to me, yell at me. Tell me everything, just never give me silence again." He didn't wait for her answer. He kissed her again, his hand sliding down to the buttons at the back of her dress. There was no hesitation now. The ghost marriage was dead. They were flesh and blood, heat and friction. He pulled her up onto the desk, pushing the remaining inkwells and quills out of the way with a clatter. The heavy wood groaned in protest. Beatrice pulled at the collar of his linen shirt, the fabric tearing slightly at the seam as she sought the heat of his skin. There were no flowery metaphors in the dark study. There was only the rough scrape of his jaw against her neck, the heavy weight of his body pressing her into the wood, and the sound of their ragged breathing filling the room. It was grounded. It was chaotic. It was real, and as Arthur buried himself in the warmth of his wife, the Duke of Somerset realized that the chaos he had spent his life fearing was the only thing that had ever truly saved him. The silence was shattered, but the true story of the Duke and Duchess of Somerset has only just begun. From cold transactions to fiery surrender, Arthur and Beatrice proved that the deepest love isn't found in perfect romance, but in the messy, fierce reality of choosing each other. What did you think of Arthur's ultimate sacrifice with the deed? Was Beatrice right to tear it up? If you loved this story, hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another intense, grounded historical romance. Drop a comment below. Who was your favorite character in this battle of wills?